So just kind of a background. Data has shown that over the past few decades that fires in the West have seasons getting longer for the fire season, as well as wildfire frequency and severity is increasing. And this seems to be tied to mainly increasing air temperature as well as earlier snow melt, so you're getting more drying throughout the earlier in the year, which is leading to larger fires. And data has shown when they're doing some climate modeling that it's going to continue to increase throughout the southern Rockies, and we're going to see more larger fires throughout the southern Rockies here. So it looks to be a trend that's going to continue. So we look at stream ecosystems. There's basically two different types of effects that wildfires can have in on-stream ecosystems. First one is direct effects, mainly through increased stream temperature, altered water quality, mortality of aquatic organisms, and these are largely dependent on the extent and severity of the fire. We also have indirect effects, and these are basically influenced and constrained by the direct effects. And basically, we get changes in the supply of water, sediment, and woody debris into the stream, increases in stream temperature, which can last up to a decade, depending on how much of the vegetation around the stream was lost. We also get shifts in food webs. So just, Bob showed this map earlier, just where the fire was. And on the caldera, we really have two main watersheds. This lower one here being the East Fork of Jemez, and this upper one being the San Antonio Creek with Indios Creek coming into it. And basically where we're going to focus on is the Rio San Antonio. And after the fire, as we know, we get our monsoonal rains in New Mexico. We have these problems with large floods. So Indios Creek on July 29th, Dr. Parmenter just happened to be out there, got some excellent pictures. You know, we had huge, massive debris flows that came down through the Indios and San Antonio. It's estimated that about 35,000 brown trout were killed out of the stream. Not sure if we have any numbers on what the natives, how many we lost in there. Got some data from a data song that happened to be right below confluence with Indios Creek and San Antonio. At the time of the flood, you can see how these water parameters change, where obviously turbidity, we've got a huge spike. Conductivity, we've got a spike. Temperature had a downward spike, just the amount of rainwater going into the stream. Some changes in dissolved oxygen as well as pH. When Dr. Parmenter was out, he also smartly grabbed a water sample of that ash debris flow coming down through the stream. That sample is this one right here. And this is about what the stream normally looks like, a water sample. So I have water quality run on that. You see total suspended solids, huge increase to be expected looking at that water. Increasing conductivity again, phosphorus, nitrogen, and ammonia, which is the big one. You can see that normally less than 0.1 milligrams per liter. That sample was at 1.65 milligrams per liter. The lethal concentration for salmonids, 50% of population at 96 hours, is about 0.5 to 0.8 milligrams per liter. So we were way above that, and mostly, not only were those fish getting, you know, having to deal with all the debris and ash in the water quality parameters were so bad that, you know, it was not a good day to be a fish within those creeks. So basically what we've been doing is just monitoring and recovery of the fish populations in both Indios and Rio San Antonio. Basically we want to look at how the natives are responding. You know, we have blue grand chub, blue grand sucker in the stream, so we want to see how they're responding, as well as brown trout, which supports a major fishery on the Valles Caldera. And we also want to look at, you know, how the stream habitat's responding after these floods. So we're kind of focused up here in the northeast part of the caldera. Had 3 sites on Indios Creek located down towards the bottom of the stream here, as well as 3 on San Antonio Creek. And basically these sites have been established prior to the fire when they actually did a study on how prescribed burn was affecting the stream. So we had these sites set up already. And we had some fish census data, but the most recent one for those sites was from 2007. So fairly recent. It would have been nice to have it straight up to the fire, but you know, they stopped that study, so there was nothing going on. But we lacked habitat data, so we can't really do a pre and post fire look to see how much the habitat changed from before the fire. All we can do is monitor how it's, you know, changing after the fire. So basically what we did, fish surveys to past depletion within each one of those reaches, which are 50 meters long. Also doing habitat monitoring, stream geomorphology, looking at bank width with the depth ratio. And we're also looking at the substrate using aluminum pebble count. And we're also doing carbon nitrogen monitoring to see how much carbon from the ash is actually in the stream. And we began this in the fall of 2011, right after those floods occurred. So to just kind of look at our fish data, we looked at our pre-data from about 2005 to 2007. These are averages for the stream from the 3 sites, with Indios Creek being those open circles and San Antonio Creek being those black triangles, with brown trout density and fish per 100 meter squared. You can see that the densities within both streams are fairly high. You know, they range a little bit, but not too much. We go from, at the lowest, you know, around 30 fish per 100 meters squared to over 100 fish per 100 meters squared in some cases. So very high densities. And what we found immediately after those floods was very low populations. Currently still seeing those low populations where we're basically between those 3 reaches on any given stream, we get maybe 1 fish. So I mean, we've gone from super high density of fish to nothing there. So you know, those floods really knocked back the populations. We haven't seen any natives in these reaches here. We've seen natives farther down, and the natives seem to be doing okay farther down, but we haven't seen any move up into this area yet. To look at how the substrate looks immediately after the fire and a year now, just from this fall 2012, looking at percentage of substrate less than 2 millimeters. So you can see in the Indios, you know, very high amounts of fine substrate, over 50% between any of the 3 reaches pretty much. This actually decreased by this past fall, where we're seeing around 20% throughout there. In San Antonio, a little bit different story. Immediately after those floods, about the same as Indios, where you're around 50% in the reaches. But it actually increased through, by this past fall, so we're still seeing a high percentage of substrate. There's a lot of fine substrate coming down into these streams, and I'll get to that in a little bit. We're also seeing, when we look at the width-to-depth ratios and bankable width, for the Indios here, looking at width-to-depth ratio, immediately after the fire, fairly low to increasing, so these streams appear to be getting a little bit wider and a little bit shallower, and it's possibly due to the amount of sediment that's actually coming into it. It's just raising the bottoms of the streams up. And similar story in San Antonio, where we're seeing increasing width-to-depth ratio and increasing bankable width. So just to kind of sum up what we found so far, you know, those brown trout populations are still extremely low, and we haven't detected any natives in those sampling reaches. And it's possible, you know, there was a small part of the Indios at the headwaters that wasn't hit by the fire, and there are brown trout up there. We haven't seen any natives, and populations were really pushed back pretty much the whole way down to the boundary of the Via Caldera. So it seems like, you know, those fish are just taking their time to move back up in. And with the substrate howlets, it's not the best habitat currently. And we are still seeing this minor shift in stream geomorphology with wider shallow reaches in both streams, but we didn't have any after those massive floods, you know, no real channel reorganization. So that was good. And again, high fine sediment inputs are likely to continue. This is on Indios Creek, a above our sample site, or our sampling areas, and you can see the amount of sediment. There was some channel reorganization up here, and the amount of sediment that's still in the stream, as well as ash, just pretty much piled up in some of these areas around the stream. So we're going to still see those fines coming into the stream for the foreseeable future until we get some good floods to really wash them out. So just some of the difficulties we had, just mainly lack of pre-fire habitat data. It would have been awesome to have that data. It's good to have the fish data. You know, we can actually see those huge changes that we had from those floods. And, you know, it just kind of points out it's important to have the, you know, data on a variety of these streams, you know, have the habitat data. And, you know, really important with these non-natives in there that we're trying to bring back. So just a final thought, you know, it also provides interesting look into, you know, these meadow systems versus forest systems, how they get affected by those post-fire floods and debris flows. Mainly, you know, these open meadow streams, those floods were just able to get right out on a floodplain, and so you didn't get that channel reorganization that you normally see in more forested streams. So just thank everyone that helped with field work, and all there for letting us come up there and poke around. And with that, I'll take any questions. Yeah.
So, and I don't know if you have answer this, but you managed to see this as an opportunity to focus on native fish species over non-natives?
Well, we definitely, you know, with the rear grand sucker and rear grand chub being on there, definitely a chance to kind of get them back in there. But as far as any other natives, not too much focus there.
So the emphasis will be on brown trouts?
Yes. Is that?
I think, yeah, for the recreational fisheries, brown trout is the one that's we'd like to see come back in there. We have been talking about reintroducing the Rio Grande cutthroat into the Rio San Antonio as well. So we'll see how that progresses in the future. We've got a big NEPA task ahead of us, but we've been coordinating with the Santa Fe and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Trout Unlimited and New Mexico Trout to work on that. So one of the things that, you know, Matt was focusing here on the upper watersheds where the flooding impact was the greatest, especially with the ammonia concentrations. We have 10 years of data from further downstream of fish populations. This is where the natives have actually started to increase now that the brown trout are gone. Their top predator is missing. So the native fish, the Rio Grande sucker and the Rio Grande chub, which we had actually reintroduced to the Rio San Antonio in 2007 because they had been extirpated somewhere along the way. And so those populations are now breeding and are expanding their distributions upstream in the absence of the brown trout. So they haven't made it yet to the Toledo and the Indios Creek, but it'll be a really interesting scenario to see if the natives get there first and if they can build up their populations that are sustainable once the brown trout come back in. So from a recreational fisheries point of view, yes, brown trout is the one at the moment. Native fish will hopefully survive better and come back in. So, okay. Any other questions for Matt?
Did you guys do some similar work on the East Fork?
We haven't, no, but they also have population data from that, so they're keeping track of that.
Right, the Upper East Fork, that's a really interesting scenario there. The Upper East Fork took some initial hits from floods off of Pajarito and Cerro Grande, but they have rainbow and brown trout. Those have come back initially very strongly, but the nutrient pulse that came in there with it has just exploded the algal population. So the streams are now full of algae and aquatic macrophytes like Elodia and things like that. So that the channel is almost filled in with filamentous algae and whatnot. So the trout have been pushed out again. Further down in the middle of the Valle Grande, we had this huge pulse of sediment from the floods that filled in the channel to the point that there is no channel anymore. And it's like a giant fan out there with water moving through the marshy wetland area. And then the channel reforms further down. So it'll be really interesting to see the dynamic of of whether that fen gets established permanently with aquatic macrophytes, emergent macrophytes, root systems, older than it is. Really dynamic system. This flood scenario has been quite remarkable, to say the least. Still have 4 minutes. Molly.
How long did it take for the nutrients to come back down to pre-existing before the fire?
We're still working on some of that data. We don't have that completely analyzed yet, so we're still working on doing that.
Yeah, the one thing I can add to that real quick is that the ammonia levels that showed up, of course, ammonia is part of the nitrogen cycle coming out of soils and forests and whatnot, and the heat of the fire in the soils interrupted that nitrogen cycle. So that ammonifying bacteria are still working away, building up ammonia, but nitrifying bacteria that normally take the ammonia and turn it into nitrite and nitrate in the nitrogen cycle, those are killed off by the heat. So the ammonia builds up, floods, the rain comes in, the ammonia dissolves, washes down the stream, and you get this big pulse of ammonia hitting these guys. Well, ammonia is also a very valuable nutrient to algae and plants, and it also volatilizes into the atmosphere very readily. So at the upper watersheds where Matt and Colleen are working, big ammonia concentrations. But as it goes downstream, that ammonia will start to drop. And the fish populations, including the brown trout, at the west end of the San Antonio and the Caldera were not affected. Fish populations were just fine, you know, just days after the flood. So it was one of those things that the wave of ammonia in the water was very ephemeral. And of course, brown trout are German browns, right? They're from Europe, so are rainbows. Does Germany and France have landscape level fires with massive floods afterwards? No, it's too wet. So they haven't evolved with us, but our native fish did just fine.
Yeah, they definitely seemed to, when we got in there initially right after the floods pretty much, we came up and went out and kind of just went down through the watershed, and it was you couldn't buy a brown trout in some of those places. We did find natives in quite a few places, so it was pretty amazing to see that they were kind of hanging out still. So
Something to this evolution.
yeah.
Very good. Any further questions? Very good. Thanks, man. Appreciate it. So we've got 1 minute here. I'll go ahead and start to introduce our next speaker. Rebecca Oertel spent a number of years with the USGS at Bandelier National Monument, working with the infamous Craig Apple, working on plans and a variety of other projects over there. And 2 years ago, she moved over to the Valles Caldera as a forest and range plant ecologist, and now is in charge of running all the vegetation studies. And so I asked her to join this symposium today, this technical session today, to discuss the habitat changes of plants and forests and grasslands, because of course that forms the bottom of the food chain that feeds up into all the wildlife issues that are going to be discussed later on. So we need to have a good understanding of what the fire did to the vegetation and the habitat, and we'll go from there. So, Rebecca Oertel.
Okay, yes, my name's Rebecca Oertel, and I decided to start with this slide again. You've already seen it twice, but what it gives us is a nice view of what the fire intensities were here. So we've got the reds, the yellows, and the lows. It's actually blue. It shows up as a white here, and then an unchanged in the darker green. And again, about half of the caldera burned here. To give you a little bit more detail about these bird severities. Here they are again, similar kinds of colors. But by vegetation type, I'll break them down a little bit for you. So there's about 30,000, it's actually bumped up once we redid the analysis, but about 30,000 acres burned here. And the breakdown is in the grasslands, we had approximately 6,000 total between the lower and upper montane grasslands. But you look at these burn intensities, it doesn't add up to 100%, and that's because There's some areas that are included in the fire burned area that actually weren't burned in these severities. But it's pretty low intensities overall. Some of the upper montane burned a little hotter. Mixed conifer, 11,000 acres. Now this is a different story, and I'll get into this a little bit more, but this is some of the higher burn intensities here, moderate and high. And then the ponderosa pine was kind of a mixed bag all across all three intensities. So we had high intensities, moderate intensities, and low intensities. And then we have the spruce fir and the aspen forest, and as Bob showed in his slide, sometimes that's on the higher elevations, higher slopes. Again, they burn very hot, typically. So there's a bit of a mixed bag there. So what does this look like on the ground? Up here, high severity, steep slopes, moderate on some of the lower slopes down here, getting more into the ponderosa pine. And then we have some ponderosa pine in the grasslands in the lower areas. What I want you to notice here that's very important for wildlife is that this is very patchy, the way this burned. We have some unburned patches in here. We have some areas that burned quite hot, some spotting occurred. And here's some meadows that probably burned, but by the time the photo was taken, already coming back. I think Bob showed a couple of these slides, but just to show you again what some of the higher severity and mixed con look like. Really total consumption here of a lot of the fuels. Low and medium severity, we've got ponderosa pine here. A lot of people would say maybe it would have been nice if this burned a little hotter to get rid of some of the fuels, the standing fuels. But really kind of a mixed bag. You can see on the lower levels there's not much dead and down left. Now the grasslands, as Bob said, they burn in a vacuum fire, so the wind direction is more upslope a little bit here. And I don't know if you can see in this slide, but there are some little flames in there. It did not burn very hot. Oftentimes a vacuum fire can burn a little hotter simply because it has more residence time on the ground. But in this case, it didn't really burn very hot across the valles and the valles there. And this is what it looked like post-fire. And up here, the fire is still burning in this photograph. So, across the Valles Caldera, Will Barnes and others, Chris Hansad and Craig Allen, put in a lot of vegetation transects. And they stratified these transects across 5 vegetation types. They have, I'm trying to use that as one. Grazable woodlands up here, kind of on the upper areas of the valles, a little bit higher elevations. This is what they look like. This is after burn. But you can see, even though this burned already, this photograph was taken in 2011. Things come back pretty fast on these margins. Here's an unburned site, so you can kind of get an idea what a grazable woodland area would look like for our browsers and foragers. Mountain valley sites, they're kind of on the upper margins of these valles. Mountain meadow, we've gotten a little lower. These are going to be more riparian kinds of sites. We've got Ganthonia perrii. This is the Perry's grass. It's typically up here on these mountain valley sites, and you're looking down into the valley here. On these valles, in the grasslands, there's 44 species, pretty much, of the bunch grasses and forbs that have been recorded. Again, this is what it looks like. Here's post-fire. This is a repeat photograph. That's 3 months after the fire. Bob showed this. In 4 weeks, it went from this to this. And sometimes in some of these areas you couldn't even tell they burned. They actually walked out there and they crunched under your feet, and then it burned. And sometimes you had to get on your hands and knees and actually look. These things came back so fast. Then the last sites that we have these monitoring locations at is the riparian. And these monitoring locations have 3 100-meter transects each. And it's line point intercept transects. Riparian sites, as we've seen already in a few other slides, some of these got burned they got burned and then they got flooded. And this is one of our biomass sites, and it actually acted as an eddy, and eddied out a bunch of material onto our sample site. Here's one of our riparian transects. Again, the creek is down here. Good bit of debris and material. This is going to be great for the plants, actually. This is going to come back really well. A lot of nutrients. Bob was talking about ammonia earlier. But they came back. These areas where this was bank to bank flooding. Already it's looking really good. Well, what did the data look like that we got off these transects? So we have long-term study here, starting actually, right around the end of 2001. But most of the sites began in 2002. And down here you can see GW is grazable woodland that I showed you, mountain meadow, mountain valley, and these R's are our riparian sites. So the first thing that leaps out to most people is these dips here, drought, good indicator of our drought. And then you can see how even up to 2011, we have a slight drop, not a lot in your total percent cover. Changes here. Again, on heights, this slide I'll go through just quickly because the heights can often be so precipitation dependent. Species diversity. Even, you can see them fluctuating, but here in 2011, it's only a slight drop, not what you would really expect to see after a fire so quickly in 2011, because we monitored this only 2 months after the fire came through. Species richness, again, kind of a similar thing, a bit of a drop, and I'll get into a little bit more detail on some of these. Grass covers, kind of a similar thing. Note that this top line here is the mountain valley sites, so that was the upper margins of those valleys. Tends to have a lot more cover, probably some of those bunch grasses are driving that. So now let's just focus on the grasslands. So you look across, here's where the fire happened. Now I'm starting to include the 2012 data that we got on these plots. And really, we're not seeing a whole lot here between our burden and our control. So I know this is a complicated slide for folks to look at, but really what I want to point out at first here is just that we have control sites, pre-fire and post-fire, and these burn sites, pre- and post-fire. And a summary slide to show you what this looks like. So down here on the right, we've got the control sites. On the left, the two burned pre and post. The blue is Kentucky bluegrass, Polyprotensis. The red is one of our festucas, Arizonica, and Idahoensis. So this leaps out at me saying our control sites actually have a little bit better Polyprotensis pre and post fire than our burn sites. But even so, if you just focus now on the burn sites, the Kentucky bluegrass really liked the fire. It was one of the species that benefited, and our two festucas didn't like it so much. Now we'll look at three dominant forage species. Really, on this slide, I just want you to see our dandelion. That's what that is. Common dandelion really did well with the fire. And, possibly this is just because dandelions have that deep taproot, and we're able to survive and be able to store material in the taproot and then come back immediately when a little bit of rain came. Some of the other species, their roots are a little more shallow, and just even a low severity fire may have caused them to not come back as well. So there's the same slide I had earlier, but these are the species in green are positively affected. So again, we've got the Kentucky bluegrass, common dandelion, and then we have a couple other lower percentage species here that also did well, slender wheatgrass and some needles. Ones that didn't do so well with the fire, this does not show up very well at all. But I can just tell you the fescue that I mentioned before, the western yarrow didn't do so well. And another slide to just show the same point. But what I've got here is it's broken down by functional groups so that you can tell better on the forage levels for the wildlife species, kind of what we're looking at. And they generally decrease. So we've got going right to left. You've got 2009, 10, and 11. So the grasses decreased slightly. Forbs pretty significantly. Exotic forbs, that's driven by teon, that's the dandelion. Exotic grasses, not a lot of change, but the Kentucky bluegrass here, poker. And this nice little side over here, the carrot species, which a lot of these carrot species have a lot of nutritional value for foraging. Carrots loves fire, typically. It's a sedge. That's what it looked like on the ground on those sites. So what about the nutritional value of some of these? Now this data comes from the Toledo fire, which is a prescribed burn dome caldera. We've got burned and unburned crude percent protein on two of the primary grasses, Arpario grass and Arizona fescue. And so the burned sites have a higher protein content than the unburned. Calcium, similar kind of thing for both grasses. They did better in burned. Fiber, just the opposite. The fiber percentages are actually higher on the unburned in this case. But overall, the relative feed value, and this is really quite important and explains a lot of times why these animals are going into these areas post-fire. The relative feed value is really high on the grasslands after fire. So switching up quickly here, we have also put in 24 forest plots across the caldera immediately after the fire because we wanted to see what was happening in these thick forests after the material is left, and over time we'll monitor the succession of the vegetation. We put in 12 mixed con, 12 ponderosa pine, and then 6 each burned and unburned for each of those. I mean, yeah, high severity and unburned basically. Oops, no one backwards. This just gives you an idea of how they're distributed across the preserve. So we have, with the fire coming across here, these are our burned forest plots and our unburned forest plots. And this is just a few months after the fire, one of our ponderosa pine sites. Already you're seeing a lot of nice vegetation coming up. This is how thick they were. Bob mentioned this before. This is one of our unburned sites and one of our burned sites. Again, mixed conifer, seeing a lot of algae growth by 2012. What I want to point out here is the patchiness that I mentioned before. We have some unburned areas here. This is a nice meadow. If it burned at all, it's already come back. And then there's some green trees in the background. And when you get these nice mosaics, it's great for vegetation to come back, which also means then that you're going to get more insects back, wildlife, and the whole succession of the ecosystem can happen with this kind of nice mosaic that we got all across the caldera. Ponderosa pine. There's our burn site. Back here, Alicia in a little bit we'll be talking about, that's a arthropod pitfall trap back here that's also co-located with our veg sites. And this is September 2011, September 2012, big change. So in the next couple slides, I'll give you some data on what we actually saw on these transects and why this actually is important for our insects and wildlife that folks are going to talk about in a minute. So these two slides, we've got ponderosa pine on this side, mixed conifer on the right. We're looking at total percent cover of the vegetation, and the different colors, burned is in red, it's easy to remember. So in 2011, a decrease in percent cover you would expect immediately after the fire. But by 2012, look at the changes here already. Again, we have some pretty big error bars, but it was obvious on the ground, as you can even see in the photograph that I showed. Mixed conifer, percent covers, not as dramatic. And part of this, I think, is simply because these were terribly thick forests, and it's going to take some time to actually see some changes here. And then we have some statistics down here that basically sum up what I've just said. Ponderosa pine, the reason there's no significance here is simply if you average these two burned effects out, it ends up being a non-significant event here. But for the sake of time, I'm going to keep moving. Litter, just as you would expect. Post-fire, litter goes away. But it does start to come back over time. We're not going to see that yet on these slides, but both ponderosa pine and mixed conifer, you see this kind of thing happening. Again, we've got some stats to show you this. Bare ground, really significant increases. A lot of this is just, we had an initial pulse of some litter, then we get the rainfall, the litter's starting to wash away. One of the interesting things that I find with this is some of these species come back really quickly. This is, for those of you who recognize it, it's a Rocky Mountain maple. Really nutritious at this point. This is great for a lot of foraging species. We don't really have that many deer. I think Jimmy's going to talk about some of this a little bit later, but we don't have a lot of deer on the caldera, but the elk love to browse this. Very high nutrition. It has, I showed you some numbers before, but this particular species has right around 8% crude protein and somewhere around 3% fat. So it's not really good, but it's in the moderate range for wildlife. But we are seeing these things come back rather quickly. So speaking of that, I'll tell you a little bit about the species richness. Again, here are ponderosa pine, it's conifer, 2011, 2012. Species richness, much higher on the ponderosa pine stand already. The mixed conifer going up as well, and the controls are staying pretty much the same. Evenness, we're seeing pretty much the same over time, I'd say. On these, we're getting a little bit of significance, but I expect these to start trending in a better direction from this. And the species diversity. This is Shannon Wiener, excuse me. I think I'll just skip this and we'll get to some questions here. But I wanted to especially thank a lot of people who read these transects over the years and helped me out in these last 2 years that I've been in the caldera. And Will Barnes especially, who put in so much time on installing these transects and working with the data. So that's it. Does anybody have any questions?
How would you quantify grasslands severity in terms of high severity and low severity, just based on percentage burn?
Well, I think those came, if I'm correct, Bob, in the bear team's methods of determining fire severity. There are a lot of different ways to determine fire severity, but these particular delineations were done by the bear team, and often that's just done from aerial photographs and from the amount of canopy that's scorched or burned. Has a little bit of wiggle room in it for anybody who's familiar with how the BEAR stands for Burned Area Emergency Response Team. That's the folks that come in and that immediately after a fire and do an assessment of the fire area.
How did the BEAR burn severity map ground truth? Did you guys ground truth?
I think it was fairly close. The patchiness makes it difficult. You know, in any kind of mapping, you get some error in that. Especially if you're doing aerial, you can't. If there's some canopy, you're not really going to see what actually happened on the ground. But for the most part, it was pretty good.
Yeah, they had teams that came out and walked the ground out with their maps based on aerial photos and all that. So we're good. Great, thank you. Oh, one more.
Just one quick one. Did you guys do soil loss? Did you measure soil loss on those sites as well?
No, we didn't.
Yeah. We have some on archaeological sites that have been measured, and it was phenomenal. We saw a lot of pedestaling with little pebbles sitting on columns of soil protected from the rain. And the estimates that Dr. Anna Steffen were giving us were something on the order of 1,000 tons per acre of soil was moved off of some of the steeper slopes. Usually associated with our obsidian quarries that have been used by humans for 10,000 years. So it was really, the steeper the slope, the more we lost along those lines. But I think the erosion question is going to be handled using LiDAR, is by luck alone. Even a blind dog gets an acorn every now and then. is I had commissioned a LiDAR flight in collaboration with the University of Arizona's Critical Zone Observatory program, and we flew the entire preserve in 2010. So we have sub-meter data across all the preserve and boundary area. And so we can go back in say 5 or 6 years and fly it again and be able to check the change in the soil levels by watershed all the way through. So we'll get to it, but not immediately, sad to say.
It would have been nice to have have some sort of monitoring out there for that, because obviously when you walk out of the ground, the next year you go out, whoa, where did all the soil go?
That's great.
We don't have any numbers for it.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate it. I have a quick announcement before I introduce our next speaker here. It seems that the silent auction closes at about 10:15 today, and winners can pay any time after that until about 12:30 today in the Ivory Room. So if you have a bid on silent auction, then it should be there. Our next speaker is Professor Jerry McJacoby, who's a professor emeritus from Highlands University and has undoubtedly the expert on aquatic invertebrates in New Mexico for many, many years. We won't tell you how many is up. And Jerry has received a lot of awards from all his lifetime of work, including just this last year, the Environmental Stewardship Award by the Society of Freshwater Science for helping to restore flow in the Santa Fe watershed. So he's worked all over the place here and has extensive experience in both the Valles Caldera and lots of streams in northern New Mexico. So Jerry will talk to us about the flooding effects of the post-fire environment on the macroinvertebrate community. Jerry?
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the first and last invertebrate presentation for this conference. Although I believe in one of the early workshops on the pesticide application, there was a discussion of the effects of pesticides on aquatic macroinvertebrates, and my colleague Dan McGuire here gets to share some of his experiences on that. I would like to, first of all, start by thanking these people that helped me get down the road. I'll thank Bob for getting me back to the caldera to do some work. My wife, who does the computer work for me and statistics. The world is becoming a tuxedo world with technology, and I'm still wearing a pair of brown shoes. So bear with me on this. But Dan McGuire, I appreciate his assistance. He helps me with the QA/QC and then does the chironomic midges, which most people tend to avoid. But Dan said to be sure to mention that the dippers, the true flies, are the most important group of invertebrates in the system, and there I said it, Dan. Okay, the other folks have helped me in the field. Well, this is a picture of flooding on Los Indios, and this is from Bob Parmenter, and this is the old dam site on Los Indios, and you can see the water rushing through this narrow gap here, and this is an interesting area, and I'll talk about it in just a little bit, try to characterize my 3 study sites. But this is the flood that came through on the 29th of July in 2011, and Bob had me in there on the 1st of August, just a couple of days later, to do macroinvertebrate sampling in this area. Now you got to remember the macroinvertebrates are probably the most important group of critters in this whole picture, because we heard Matt talk about fish. Well, the fish have to eat something, whether you're talking about brown trout, sport fish, or the native fish that are in there. So we had the ash that brought, well, the flooding that brought down a lot of ash, but the other thing that I'm concerned with too is just the large amount of sediment, the inorganic material that came down. And this is higher up on Los Indios, and this is just a flood plume that came through. Oops, what did I just do? See, there we are. I hit the top. I'm sorry, I turned the whole damn thing off.
Focus is up and down keys.
Okay. very sorry on that. But this is what happened in the upper Indios watershed. We had the ash come through first, and then second we had the sediment. And we're talking about the inorganics, the fines, but then there were also large boulders that were moved by this. Well, this is the group that I'm talking about, the aquatic macroinvertebrates. These are the mayflies, the stoneflies, the caddisflies, the midges, the scuds, the side swimmers, the worms, the clams, the snails. This is the food base for the fishery. I want you to focus on a couple of critters right here. This is Eccentrus, one of the caddisflies. This is a nice clean specimen right here. This is Calabetus, which is related to Betus, which is one of the more dominant collector gatherers in the system, but they'll play an important role as we move further into the presentation. Well, the objectives, the rationales. I'm going to kind of walk through the process on this because the methodologies that are involved in this are a little bit different than some of the other studies, but the fish food organisms, that's this group that I'm working with. And I was brought back in after doing a study in 2005 through 2007 on the control burn. Like I said, I came back in here on the 1st of August in 2011 and to determine the effect of this Los Conchas fire. And again, just to keep in mind what we're working with are the macroinvertebrates. Besides being a food